Thank you all for coming to listen to this timely panel about the rise of anti-Semitism. We thought it could never happen again. That Jews are slaughtered in the cruelest way, beheaded, burned, raped, beaten up. And yet we saw it in Israel 2 weeks ago. And we thought that the resurging anti-Semitism in Europe would never come to America. And yet we saw in the past 2 weeks that it did come to America, in some ways even worse than in Europe. While students in Europe yell, "Free, free Palestine," and "Israel genocide," and so on, American students carry signs with paragliding murderers, glorifying them as liberators. Also, we heard university professors in America express their joy about the atrocities committed by Hamas. And we saw Jewish students being humiliated, intimidated, threatened, attacked on America's campuses. This is worse than what happens today in Europe. I hear from my European friends, and for those who don't know, I am originally from Europe, from Holland, and emigrated to the United States in 2006. I hear from my European friends that Jews there are starting to pull their children from public school and put them in Jewish schools instead. And that some are removing their mezuzah, the little scroll, from their front doorpost to hide they're Jewish. The one and only Jewish newspaper in Amsterdam is now delivered in a white envelope. This is worse than in America. Yet, I just heard the home of a Jewish family was invaded around the corner of our house in Studio City, Los Angeles, and the home invader threatened the family, yelling, "Free Palestine," and "Kill the Jews." What was much better in America, you won't believe it, but it's true. What was much better in America than in Europe in the past 2 weeks was the support for Israel and the Jewish people, among others, from the media. But also the military support, of course, and public opinion. The personal support and sympathy from our friends and colleagues. Even CNN was better than the media in Europe. Our Jewish friends and family in Europe envy us for it. I remember Europe was like that, with all the support in all areas. I remember Europe was like that during the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. But that is all gone now, and that started with the universities. By the time I went to college in Amsterdam, in the late 70s, universities had become bulwarks of Marxism, infusing us with white guilt over our colonial past and filling us with rage about the last colonial regime still standing, Israel. Arafat was glorified as a freedom fighter. In the 90s, every journalist in Europe had gone through this kind of education, and as a result, the European media turned anti-Israel and often used classic anti-Semitic accusations like a nation of child killers. After the media turned, the population turned. A poll in the Netherlands last week showed that only 25% of the Dutch population is backing Israel in the current war. Many agree that Israel should stop the child killing. If we don't stop the anti-Israelism, the anti-Semitism in America's universities now, the majority of Americans will turn anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic a generation from now. I have the honor to further discuss all this with our two distinguished panelists. I will first introduce the panelist that is new to this audience. Naya Lekht was born in the former Soviet Union and came to the United States with her family in 1989. She holds a PhD in Russian literature from UCLA. She has done research and spoke about Soviet literature and film. At Club Z, she directed the education of Zionism and Jewish pride for Jewish youth. Naya is a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism, or ISGAP, where she is analyzing current antisemitism and is developing methods for teaching youth on antisemitism. In addition, Naya is the editor for White Rose magazine, a magazine about extremism and teaching classical liberalism. And she has a monthly column in the Jerusalem Post. Our other panelist hardly needs to be introduced to this audience. Our Robert Spencer is the director of Jihad Watch and a Shulman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He is the author of 27 books, including The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS, The Critical Quran Explained from Key Islamic Commentaries and Contemporary Historical Research, and The Sumter Gambit, How the Left is Trying to Foment a Civil War. Robert has led seminars on Islam and Jihad for the FBI, the United Central Command, and other national security and counterterrorism departments of the United States government. Robert is also a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy. Naya and Robert, welcome and thank you for coming on this panel.
Thank you.
Naya, I'll start with a question for you. So, the glorification and joy at American universities about Hamas' horrendous attack is so incomprehensible to us that many of the nation's brightest students, professors, and university leaders cannot see the inhumanity of what happened in Israel and hail it as the beginning of a better world, allowing campus to become unsafe for Jews as well. It's so incomprehensible to us. You have experience and expertise in educating young people about anti-Semitism. Can you give us some insight into the twisted minds of these students and their professors and university leaders? What are they thinking? And where did this come from?
Okay, can you all hear me? Yes? All right. So thank you very much for having me today. I want to begin by tracing just the last week and a half to 2 weeks in the United States of America. In Tulane University here, Jewish students were harassed and accosted, and an Israel flag was burnt about a day ago. This is on social media. About a week and a half ago, a former student of mine who's a freshman at UC Berkeley called me in a panic. He was harassed and he was actually attacked. He was walking across campus wearing a kippah and an Israel flag, and they came up to him and they started to tear the kippah and the Israel flag away from him. He said to me, "But Naya, you'd be very proud I didn't let go of the Israel flag." In Cornell University, we have a Professor Russell Rickford who said it was exhilarating, the brutalization of women and children. At Cooper Union College in New York, students were barricaded. I mean, in the United States of America in 2023, Jewish students are barricaded in a library because they feel that unsafe. A Jewish student was beaten with a stick at Columbia University 2 weeks ago. This is just 2 weeks. And I realize this isn't a conference per se about anti-Semitism, but this I'm going to begin with. Anti-Semitism is an alarm system. Where there is anti-Semitism, there is a much bigger threat to civilization. Israel is fighting on the front lines for the rest of the world right now, because this isn't just about Israel. This is about attacking freedom, Western civilization. So I just wanted to start with that, but I do want to answer your question. In order to answer your question, how is it that we have professors who are screaming, "It was exhilarating"? How is it that we have multiple departments, most of them in humanities, who sign on to the BDS campaign, who equate Israel with the Nazi state, Robert Spencer is going to speak more about the Islamic influence. I'd like to speak about the Marxist influence, about the Soviet Union. Indeed, I was born in the former Soviet Union, but I arrived here when I was 6 years old, and much of the stories that I learned about what is anti-Zionism, I learned from my parents. And I want everyone here to understand, American Jews are not the first, so to speak, victims of anti-Zionism. These were the Soviet Jews. My parents, that generation experienced it first. The Soviet Union is a very interesting empire, if you will, to study in this particular case. In 1948, Stalin voted yes in the UN partition for the State of Israel, but we won't go into the history, I don't have too much time, but by 1967 there's a ginormous shift in the Soviet Union in the sense that you have 1948 approval, sanctioning of a Jewish state, because Stalin thought this would be, a small Soviet state, an outpost in the Middle East for the Soviet Union. But it didn't go that way, and when Israel actually turned towards the West rather than towards the Soviet Union, the Soviets turned very much against Israel. We can argue here whether they were informed or shaped by anti-Semitism, but what they produced is an anti-Zionist campaign, a very, very well-fabricated campaign. Language such as Zionism is racism was not born in the university hallways in the United States of America, it was born in the Soviet Union. Equating Israel to an apartheid state, not born in America or Europe, it was born in the Soviet Union. So the Soviets created this amazing anti-Zionist machine, if you will, and with it, they also shipped a certain narrative framework. And I've been to a few talks today and heard about this framework that is obsessed with power, that we look at the world through a lens of oppression and oppressed. You can also thank the Soviet Union, Marxism, for that framework. And if you are going to look at the world and judge state actors based on such framework, if you were an alien and descended and looked at Israel, you would most likely think that Israel is the oppressor because Israel has power. I mean, if you know nothing, no context, Israel has an army. The Palestinian Arabs do not. Israel has sovereignty, they do not. Israel has a state, they do not. Right? They're the quintessential underdog. And so in such a framework, the underdog, because of Marxism, everything is about power structures. That's how you analyze the world. For Marxism, it was about class and class consciousness. In the United States of America, we are dealing with race consciousness and gender consciousness, but that's for another day. But when it comes to Israel, and when it comes to how is it that these professors all of a sudden find themselves calling Hamas exhilarating and butchering of women and children exhilarating, because our students are on the front lines and they're hearing violence is justified when a people is occupied, right? So if you're looking at that lens, oppression leads to violence. That's just not true. Look at the Jewish experience. I talk to my Jewish students all the time. The Jewish people were kicked out of the land of Israel 2,000 plus years ago, okay? You could say, I could, with confidence, that Jewish history is a history of oppression. Jews were oppressed in Eastern Europe, Jews were oppressed in Arab lands living as dhimmis. They did not seek violence. They did not go rape, butcher children, women, elderly. So this entire framework, the only way, and we will get to this later, but the only way to really deal with the problem, it's not the problem of anti-Semitism, the problem is the framework itself, which breeds and primes one to become anti-Semitic. So I just wanted to explain. So in terms of the Soviet Union, the Soviets in 1967 fabricated this really behemoth of a campaign against Israel and against Zionists. And they shipped it to the West, they shipped it to the Arab world. We heard from Melanie Phillips earlier where she discussed how the Soviets basically gave the Palestinians their national Palestinian narrative. Yasser Arafat would be coming all the time to Moscow, to the KGB. Mahmoud Abbas, who's the Palestinian Authority leader, wrote his dissertation in Moscow State University, effectively denying the Holocaust. So what we have, we're picking up the remnants of the Soviet system. My mother, who's not a historian, but she's a very wise woman, she says, you know, Naya, the Soviets may have lost the Cold War, but they won the ideological war. And I think she's right. I think seeing what we're seeing on our campuses, and it's not even campuses anymore, it's K through 8, it's in high schools, where if you look at the world through such a framework where oppression is just, everything you do, if you're oppressed, you're therefore justified. And if you're the oppressor, well, you're inherently evil. That is why, effectively, I believe that they've lost their minds, they've lost their moral compass, they've lost the ability to see clearly, because they've bought into this narrative. And our job is not necessarily fighting the anti-Semitism, it's fighting the narrative, which breeds the anti-Semitism.
Thank you. How did they manage to reach almost all of the school system, all of the college system?
How did they manage?
Yeah.
Well, it's a longer conversation about academia and what happened in 1960s in academia, and why, for instance, the Frankfurt School from Germany came to dominate. They were the neo-Marxists. It really comes back to Marxist ideology. So I studied literature, right? I studied Russian literature. And lo and behold, in my Russian literature classes, we did post-colonial analysis of Anna Karenina. I mean, why would we be doing post-colonial analysis of Anna Karenina, War and Peace, right? So that's Michel Foucault, right? So Michel Foucault is a very important philosopher, theoretician, lauded, lionized by academics. Because, you know, if I had to really answer you, I think all humans seek purpose. And if you don't have God, then you're going to create a different worldview wherein you want justice. These are not evil people. They want to help the persecuted. They just have terrible remedies. But to understand how they won the hearts and minds, they have won the hearts and minds, and I want to just really briefly just give you a study. So the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values in 2022 conducted a study. And I just want to show you something very interesting, and you think what you may of these results. So they compared Democrats, Republicans, and radical progressives. So what do Democrats in America care about? What do Republicans and what do progressives? So the top 5 for Democrats are inflation, economy, climate change, COVID, and crime. Okay, for Republicans, top 5 is inflation, immigration, border, economy, crime, and national security. And for the radical progressives, the top 5 are universal health care, climate change, structural racism, economy, jobs, inflation. So, and what the study actually found is a high correlation. People who hold radically progressive views end up being anti-Israel. I want to stress this really, it's very important in the work that I do. It's not that these people are inherently, they come with an anti-Semitic bias, but looking at the world, where you care about universal health care, climate change, structural racism, inflation, economy, and you apply the lens of power and powerlessness, you are going to end up being against the state of Israel. So the battle is it's a deep battle. It's a long battle. Anti-Semitism is just the alarm. It's the alarm that something is rotten in Denmark.
Thank you. Robert, we often hear this narrative of oppression and victimhood of the Palestinians and their lack of self-determination as the cause of Hamas's brutal attack and as the root of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What do you think of that narrative?
The whole idea of situating this conflict in the language of oppression is just what Naya was saying, to justify any action against the oppressor. And this is actually the most impressive achievement of the Soviet propaganda starting from the 1960s, the creation of the Palestinian people themselves, who were never in existence before the 1960s. You can look at all the literature, all the contemporary newspapers, all the UN discussions, everything regarding the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, and you're not going to find any mention of the Palestinians. they did not exist. There were Arabs who were indistinguishable linguistically, culturally, religiously from the Arabs of Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. They were created by the KGB and Yasser Arafat in the 1960s precisely to be oppressed. There are no Palestinian people apart from the Marxist language of oppression that Naya was discussing. The Palestinian people only exist in order to situate the jihad against Israel, which is based on Islamic principles, within the Marxist framework of the struggle of an oppressed people against its oppressor. And thus, that is the source of the coalition between the left and Islam. The reason why negotiations have always failed is because of the maximalism of the Islamic imperative. That is, as I explained this morning, the Quran passage, drive them out from where they drove you out, that does not admit of a half solution or a negotiated peace or anything other than the total eradication of the state of Israel. Now, how do you get leftists on board with that? Is say these are an oppressed people who need to be liberated from their oppressor. So the PLO and the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, they were Marxist organizations that became progressively more Islamic as time went on. The PFLP is still essentially a Marxist organization, but it's a minority among the Islamic groups, among the Palestinian groups. The Islamic aspect of this actually came second to the Marxist part. But they were able to capitalize upon this aspect of Islamic doctrine that will not allow a non-Muslim state on territory that Islam once or ever ruled. And this creates this terrible alliance that has persisted all this time, and that we see bearing this bitter fruit today with so many non-Muslim, non-Palestinian college students all over, as Naya said, thinking their cause is righteous when they engage in this brutal and bloody behavior or justify it.
Thank you. Naya, this is a difficult topic for many of us, but I think we have to ask the question to start to understand it and then hopefully resolve it. How come there are even Jewish students and professors going along with the glorification of what Hamas did 2 weeks ago?
It's very painful to talk about this, and it's shameful. I'm going to speak about the failure of Jewish education. If you ask these people that Robert Spencer just said, who are fighting for a quote-unquote righteous cause, do you not like Jews? Are you anti-Semitic? They would say absolutely not, and they mean it. Who do they not dislike? Zionists. We don't have a problem with Jews, we have a problem with Zionists, but that's not on them, that's on us. That's on us, Jewish Americans, that we haven't educated our Jewish children to understand that to be a Jew is to be a Zionist. It's one and the same. My mother told me, again, from the Soviet Union, right before we immigrated, and of course she lost her job, one of the co-workers came to her and said, all along you've been making this into a Zionist nest. You've been transforming this job, this workplace, into a Zionist nest. And of course the left is brilliant with language. The Soviets were brilliant. They didn't say Jewish nest, they said Zionist nest because they couldn't be outwardly anti-Semitic. So again, they played that really, really well, the anti-Zionism mask. So it's a big failure, a big, huge failure on Jewish institutions and legacy organizations who have, again, I'm going to say that word again, failed to teach that Judaism is not just a religion, it's an ethnicity. We are a people from a land of Israel, number one. Number two, I also think that it's nothing new or radical that Jews are anti-Jewish. This is not new in Jewish history. again, my area is Soviet Union. When the Soviets had just taken over from the from the whites, the white being the vanguard of the Tsarists, they set up many unions and many different sections. One of them was called Yevsekция, or the Jewish section of the Soviet police. And you know what they did? You know what their whole entire raison d'etre was? Their entire goal and aim. They had to go to the Pale of Settlements, where Jews once lived, and basically humiliate, cut off beards of fellow rabbis in order to say that you have to become a Soviet. You have to jettison your Jewish backwardness or your Jewish religion. We could have been sitting and having this panel in 1919. How could there be Jews running around in the Soviet Union cutting off beards and desecrating holy, sidur, holy texts, tefillot, prayers, excuse me. So again, it's not new, right? It's not a new phenomenon, anti-Jews who are against Jews. But the only way I can rationalize it, the only way I can understand it in terms of the American context is that America, in terms of the Jewish establishment and education, massively failed in teaching their children what it means to be a Jew. That if you are a Jew, you are a Zionist. They're synonyms.
Okay, thank you. Robert, since we talk about campus and the hearts and minds of young people, can you give us a very brief overview of how the radical left and Islamism have come to dominate our campuses?
Yes, certainly. But just one note on Naya's observations there, and that is that there are many Jews, of course, who are leftists, as we all know, but leftism, because it's inherently collectivist, is anti-Jewish. And this is why it always ends up in anti-Semitism. And you have Stalin was going to persecute the Jews right before he died, and Hitler, who was essentially a man of the left in his core principles, persecuted the Jews, and so many others. This is because of the kind of thing that Naya mentioned about the Jews going to various places and saying you have to cut your beards to their fellow Jews. The whole idea of the collective is uniformity, and everybody's the same. And the Jews, as the people who've had no home for 2,000 years and were in every other culture, in every other civilization, and never gave up their individuality, they are a standing rebuke to the core idea of the left. And so it's a fundamental contradiction for Jews to be leftists, but I think they haven't really thought leftism through well enough. In any case, the campus aspect of this proceeded along the lines of that same Marxism. Now, we could have a whole discussion about how the Marxists took over the universities, and that's another story, but we know that they did, and the long march through the institutions is well known, and it was capitalized upon very cleverly by the forces of jihad and the Islamic action against Israel. One primary example of that is Students for Justice in Palestine, which is a very extensive group on 200 campuses around the country. It's essentially a gang of thugs that menaces Jewish and pro-Israeli students on a regular basis if they do anything too publicly in support of the State of Israel. The Students for Justice in Palestine was founded at University of California, Berkeley in 2001 by a professor named Hatem Bazian, who is still there, and he's a professor of Islamophobia, which is, of course, a made-up word that's designed to intimidate people into thinking that there's something wrong with resisting jihad violence and the oppression of women and others that is justified in Sharia. So Hatem Bazian is a very interesting case. He is not only the founder of Students for Justice in Palestine, he's a Palestinian Arab himself from Nablus. He is a migrant to the United States, and he very skillfully, from an early age, began to spearhead the identification of the Palestinian Jihad with the left's core ideals. For example, he was at one point, while he was a student, the leader of a group called the National People of Color Student Coalition. Now, if you've ever seen a picture of Hatem Bazian, he's a white guy. And the Arabs have always been classified as white in the US Census. And the whole idea that Arabs are people of color, I think the absurdity of this is well summed up by Hatem Bazian's friend and colleague Linda Sarsour, who has faded from public view, but she was quite prominent a few years back, the hijab-wearing far-left activist, part of the women's movement and so on. You can find a video still there on YouTube of Linda Sarsour saying that before she decided to wear hijab, she was just an ordinary white girl. And then you can also find Linda Sarsour in numerous contexts saying she is a person of color or brown. So the putting on the hijab changed her race. And that's a remarkable thing. But the whole idea is, here again, to situate the jihad against Israel in the struggle of the oppressed people against the oppressor that the left is supposed to be all about. And Hatem Bazian is a tremendous example of the success of this. As a professor at one of the leading, most far-left universities in the country, a professor of a concept that the left made up in order to demean and silence its critics. And he openly called, like over 20 years ago, for intifada in the United States. And nobody seemed to care, of course, because people who believe the same way as he does are ensconced in all the positions of power that might have called him to account. And so now we are seeing the fruits of seeds that have been planted decades ago.
And Robert, is the founder of Students for Justice in Palestine, Hatem Bazian, is he affiliated with Hamas?
Yes, he's pretty much an open supporter of it. But when he was also a student, he was in the Muslim Students Association. And the Muslim Students Association is the primary Muslim Brotherhood organization in the United States that has been explicitly tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, even in the secular media, which ordinarily ignores all this altogether. There was a big expose in the Chicago Tribune in 2004 where the Muslim Students Association was identified as the Muslim Brotherhood's chief arm in the United States. Now, in order to understand the significance of that, look at the Hamas Charter. And in the Hamas Charter, it says the Hamas organization, which, by the way, as you know, probably is an acronym for Islamic Resistance Movement. The Islamic Resistance Movement is the Muslim Brotherhood branch in Palestine. And the Muslim Brotherhood, according to a captured internal document that was discovered some years back, it is dedicated, in its own words, to eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands, that is the hands of the Westerners, they're going to kill themselves, by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that it falls and Allah's religion is victorious over other religions. That's a quote from the Quran, which speaks about how the enemies of Allah began to defeat themselves by their own hands. That is, they turned against each other and began to fight. And that is one of the core ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood, that they will sow division in the United States so that ultimately the United States will fall. And you can see it's working great.
I think it's 200 branches the students of
That's right.
The Students for Justice in Palestine have in America, and they are organizing most of these rallies on campus and intimidations of other students, Jewish students and others. So we basically have 200 branches of the Muslim Brotherhood on American campuses. my question to both of you, and then I'll open it up for the audience who must be burning with questions. How can we reverse the anti-Semitic brainwashing of students in America? Naya.
There are two schools of thought. One is change current institutions, and the second, build your own. I'm of the mindset that we've lost the institutions, we must build our own. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you are waiting until college, it's too late. We have to start winning back the hearts and minds of our children. And that means classical education, and I think Chris Rufo spoke of a curriculum that he is part of, where they're trying to basically, but they're working with the state of Florida, of course, they're working with someone who is open to it. But the point is there are tons of classically educated children who are going to classical education schools. Most of them, of course, are Christian schools. I think there needs to be a burgeoning of Jewish schools, Jewish day schools, that are teaching Western values, pro-American values, God, morality, because it's not happening in schools. And one thing I'll tell you is something else. I used to live in California as well. In California, during the height of COVID, most parents started to pull their children out of schools because they had a front row seat through Zoom of what was happening in their children's classrooms. Once again, this isn't just about the anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism is signaling the other rot. And what they saw, and what I saw, because at that time my son was in second or third grade, what we saw was they had assemblies on Zoom pledging for BLM. They were taking time out of the classroom to pledge for BLM, right? Teachers had their gender pronouns and told students to also use gender pronouns. And so what ended up happening, there was a massive wave of parents pulling their kids out. So we need to start a network, a movement. So we need to start our own institutions. What else? PragerU. PragerU is a wonderful source. They've just, it's a couple years now, they've invested in basically creating a PragerU Kids version of what they have for adults. They're growing that, educating children through YouTube, with their own YouTube channel. But I do not believe that we can change the current institutions. And one more thing I'd like to just say how dire the situation is. So that study that I referenced, the study that was conducted in 2022, they found that amongst, no surprise, amongst the boomer generation, we have 52% in favor of Israel. Within one generation, millennials, it drops to 31. I don't even know they didn't study the Gen Z. You can imagine what the Gen Z, and the interesting thing about this particular study, and I can definitely share the results with you all through the administrators here, is that the people who were conducting this survey were not necessarily interested, let's say, in who holds anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist or anti-Israel views. They were interested in seeing people who hold those views tend to vote which way, tend to believe what about climate justice, tend to believe what about reproductive justice, and there's a huge correlation. So this is about getting our kids, and the only way to get our kids back is we have to build our own schools. We have to build our own community programs. That's what I believe personally. I really do. And classical education.
Thank you. And University of Austin, Texas is also an example of a new university that wants to bring classical education. Robert, what do you think?
Well, I couldn't agree more.
How can we reverse this brainwashing?
Burn the universities down and sow the ground with salt. I just want to say hello to my friends in the NSA. No, it was just a little quip. In any case, the universities are in a terrible state, and people don't realize. The general public has no idea what propaganda factories they've become. I was talking to this guy a few years ago, and he was down the line. He would have fit right in here. He agreed with the point of view that all the speakers have espoused during this weekend on all the various issues. And then he said that he was going to give $1 million to his alma mater, which was one of the leading leftist universities in the country. And I didn't want to be rude, but I thought I wanted to say, what are you, nuts? The universities are standing against everything that we are trying to achieve, everything we're trying to defend and protect. And so they have to be thoroughly repudiated. We should see movements that want to deny them all funding that is based on taxpayer money in whatever way. And every last support, yes, that they have from the state needs to be removed. And then if George Soros wants to fund them, that's his business. But at least it will be clear that these are institutions with a particular point of view and not neutral learning academies, then nobody should be fooled.
May I just add to that, in addition to what Robert just said, which is that our universities are basically financially owned by Qatar. And so that, we can pull all the funding out. You could pull your $100,000 donation, $1 million. It stands nothing against the $20 million that they throw. I was at a conference this summer in Oxford. Somebody did a brief and showed us the map of the world and basically the chips that have been laid out by Qatar. Qatar owns 33% of the Empire State Building. Qatar owns 67% of Heathrow Airport. Why? What about Georgetown University, Columbia, NYU? We cannot send our kids to college. I'm not sending my son to college.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, but I can't resist. Why do they own 33% of the Empire State Building and Heathrow Airport? Well, they have to have a place for the plane to take off to crash into the... Anyway. Sorry.
But, Robert, do you see a way to get rid of the Qatari financing of America's universities?
That's an excellent question. That's a larger question than just Qatar as well, because you have the Chinese money, you have Saudi money, which actually is older and is waning now with the Saudi crown prince trying to change course, but the damage is done to a tremendous degree. It would be interesting to see if you could get any interest in Congress for some sort of a measure to prohibit foreign funding of American universities. That would change the cultural landscape radically overnight, probably to the extent that all the politicians who've been bought by Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the rest would oppose it vociferously.
Thank you. I want to give the opportunity to the audience to ask questions.
Evelyn, I'm right over here. So we've got time for a couple of questions. I have one quick correction. James O'Keefe at 4:15 is not in this room, but back where we had lunch. So just so you know, at 4:15. But we've got about 15 minutes, or 10 or 15 minutes. So we'll take a few questions. The first one is right here.
Hello, thank you. These are complicated issues, and when you study mathematics, you try to go fundamental, what are the fundamental things? And it seems like the things that permeate the fertilizer is destruction of family and destruction of any concept of a higher being. And no matter what, it comes down to that. You destroy a family, you destroy a concept of any higher being, you always able to get a homogeneous population, and they rely on the state.
It's interesting, what you just said is very interesting in terms of Islam, but in terms of the Soviet Union did exactly that. They replaced the family unit. They sowed into civilization distrust. Stalin was paranoid. So basically, it wasn't just that your friends or colleagues could snitch on you, your own family members. And we have a case in the Soviet Union of a boy named, Pavlik Morozov. Very Russian name. The story of Pavlik Morozov is that he ratted his father out because his father was a kulak, which is a rich peasant. And they came and they took his father away. They murdered his dad. And he became a hero. So think about for 1 second, who becomes a hero in the Soviet Union? Somebody whose loyalty is first and foremost to the idejnost, to the ideology. not to the family, which is interesting because I'm not sure how it is with Islam. I think Islam has a very strong value on family unit. So that would be an interesting kind of question.
Well, actually, the Quran repeatedly says that even if your father or your mother or your brother is an unbeliever, then you have to fight against him. That you should hate, there should be everlasting enmity. As a matter of fact, it's an interesting point. This comes in the context of a passage about Abraham, and you hear a lot about the Abrahamic faiths and how Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all children of Abraham and how wonderful that is, and it's a basis for unity. It's a lot of hogwash, because what the Quran actually says about Abraham is that he was not a Jew or a Christian, he was a Muslim. And he says to his father, who was an unbeliever, that there will be enmity and hatred between us and you forever until you believe in Allah. So he's talking to his own father, and he says, I'm going to hate you forever because you're not a Muslim. And he's held up in that specific instance as an excellent example for imitation by the Muslims.
We've got a question over here.
So, focusing on solutions, anti-Semitism has been around a long time. The Crusades weren't so great for the Jews either, so it's been a problem. So, two ideas maybe we should get behind. Number one, go ahead and revoke the 501c3 status for all of these so-called universities that are allowing Jews to be persecuted. Number two, a la what you said, great, our own institutions. What will do that in spades is if we get the states to get the money to follow the student and defund these lousy public schools.
I agree with you. Anti-Semitism is, as they say, Robert Westrich said, is the oldest hatred. It is the oldest hatred. So on that, I agree. And I'm a big believer in my dream. In one day, I will have a school. I will found my own school, and the school will teach the right values.
Okay, we're going to go Judy, and then I think Jay had a question.
Okay, you may want to bring me up to date, but as far as I know, the ZOA actually put forward a legal whatever that the government not fund any American-funded schools, any non-for-profit American-funded schools, if they are involved in anti-Semitism and things like that. And I think it was during the Trump administration. But I don't remember what the particular thing is, but I know that the ZOA went after them. So we need more of that.
The Zionist Organization of America, ZOA.
Jay, do you have a question?
Yeah,
okay.
real quick. When you mention the Qatari money and the Saudi money all coming in, is that state-sponsored money, or is that private individuals or organizations that are donating?
It's generally private individuals, but the private individuals are semi-private. I mean, you've got somebody like Al-Walid bin Talal, and he is a Saudi prince. He has poured tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into American universities, as well as other organizations and institutions in the United States. And he was actually briefly imprisoned by Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, a few years back. It appeared that he was part of a more hardline Islamic faction that was objecting to what MBS was trying to do in relaxing a lot of the Sharia requirements. So he was clearly tied into the previous Saudi regime, which you can't tell the Saudi regimes by the king. The king was the same all the way through, but who were the people really in charge? But ostensibly the money was a donation from this guy who just happened to be fantastically wealthy.
Next question right here.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your informative talk. Are you heartened to see some of the pushback that's coming from leading law firms in the United States who are revoking job offers to students who have been involved in these on-campus protests, and also I've seen other major business people saying they won't hire people from these universities. I'm surprised I didn't see this before, but it's starting to happen. And what do you think of that trend?
Naya?
I'm not quite aware of that trend, but I think it's a wonderful trend. But I'm not quite aware of it, so I cannot speak.
You, Robert?
Yeah, there are. It's very good to see that, as you noted, there are several law firms and other organizations that have said that people who are identified, and they're open about their identities, and of course the video is everywhere nowadays because everybody's got a phone, and so people who are identified at these pro-Hamas rallies have lost job offers, have had job offers rescinded. There have been announcements that nobody will be hired from this university or that university. There has been, I don't want to be a glass half empty guy, but there have been very few of these. It's heartening to see them, to be sure. You would expect there to be more. I think it's more shocking that there has been such open support and gleeful expression of joy, as Naya noted, about the massacre on October 7th. And that people seem to think they're not going to suffer any consequences for this, and for the most part they won't.
So maybe when I listen to this great conversation, Jews are not only the canary in the coal mine, but may also become the spearhead of fighting back against an ideology that affects all our freedom. What can our audience do to fight back against this ideology that is bad for Jews in universities, bad for Jews and bad for everybody? Naya.
Okay. You know, Evelyn and I were speaking earlier about this. You know, it's interesting. Everybody wants a solution. To your point, you asked, okay, what's the solution? And I can't help invoke my own background, which is a literary scholar. You know, if we look at the arc of storytelling, rising, action, tension, resolution. I mean, everybody, we just want a resolution, and an easy one. I heard we're in trouble. We are in trouble, but the fact is that you are here and are, you know, becoming more and more aware of this topic. Pull your funding out. I mean, yeah, you probably don't stand much against Qatar, but, you know, Jewish philanthropists must pull their funding from universities. I don't understand why Mr. Lauder is still funding University of Pennsylvania. I really don't quite understand that. Well, he said that he would if action wasn't, if there was no action, he would rescind his you know, hefty gift, if you will, but I haven't seen it. Again, I believe in you want to save this country, I want to too. I came from the former Soviet Union. I love the United States of America. My parents love this country. This country is freedom. But if you want to save it, let's build our own institutions. What did Turning Point USA do? Turning Point USA is a leadership program for youth. They didn't say, oh, let's try to work within the youth programs. No, they made their own. That's what we need to do. We need to make our own schools, our own universities, and be done with them.
And Robert, what can our
Become
audience
obnoxious.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I mean is, very quickly, sorry, the people here, there's half the seats empty, and I love you all, but I see you every year. Where are the new people? Have you been going out and telling people about how dire the situation is? Most of the people going about their business have no idea. And they might be receptive if you show them some of the videos from the campuses or some of the things that have been coming out lately. They might actually be moved to act, and we need to grow our numbers. That's all.
Okay, if we can do this fast, we're going to get to go from Frank up to Bernie. If we can do 2 questions, we'll see if this...
I hope this is a quick answer. Robert, we talked a little bit this morning about the President of the United States meeting with Muslim Brotherhood operatives. Could you just talk quickly about the penetration of our government by these guys in key positions, in particular in the contribution it's making to policies more generally, but specifically on the anti-Semitism issue?
Do you know that the chief negotiator that the Biden regime has for the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a Palestinian pro-jihad activist named Hadi Amr? Yes. And there are other high up in the Biden regime, other people who are Palestinian jihadis, essentially. You can be a jihadi without blowing things up if you are aiding the jihad. And this is the fruit of his promise, as Frank noted, that Biden would appoint Muslims at every level of the U.S. government. That was the Brotherhood that he was talking to. Engage is a Brotherhood organization, and the Brotherhood, as I noted before, is dedicated to eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within, but they have very cannily also situated themselves in the corridors of power. And this has been going on for years and years. Like 2002, 2005, you had Muslims hired to show that these various agencies weren't Islamophobic, and then they would target the people who were strongest and complain and get them fired, like Colonel Stephen Coughlin and so on in the Pentagon. And then they would bring in their own people, and now that's advanced by nearly 20 years. And we're seeing, once again, the fruit of it.
Okay, this will be the last question.
This is going to be a quick rhetorical question to the audience. How many of you are aware that there is a bureau in the U.S. Department of Education that accepts complaints validated for anti-Semitism on any Title VI granted organization? If you have evidence of anti-Semitism, genocide, whatever, how many are aware of that in this room? If you're complaining about your university or whatever, you can file a complaint with the evidence. They go to that university, they give them a cure period. Better yet, they'll tell you to contact that university and tell them you're about to file a complaint. It has results. It took down Northwestern University recently when they censured SJP. Thank you.
Any comment up from the group on that?
Sir, I've been involved with several Title VI, and unfortunately, most of them never ever make it to try. Never ever make it. And the only one that I'm aware of was Adela Kohab, who was able to basically win in Columbia University, but that is only because President Trump had included under the definition for Title VI, he included ethnicity as also part of the protected classes. Title VI is a very complicated, thing. You can file it. They're not terrified of it. Most of them don't win.
Just to be clear, they didn't actually file. They told Northwestern they were going to file, and the next day, Northwestern University forced SJP to take down all the posters.
Okay, that's great. That's amazing. I mean,
Also told them they'd be thrown off campus.
that's
They did that again.
amazing. But most of the time that, USC, Rose Rich, a student, was basically forced to leave campus. She was afraid for her life. She went to the Brandeis Legal Center, and they basically tried to file a Title VI, and it didn't work. But it is a recourse. It is there. And I'm really glad that it had some sort of tangible effect was it Northeastern? Northwestern.
Yep.
I want to thank Evelyn, Markus, and a wonderful panel. And